Recapitulation that I think was part of the assignment. The secret doctrine is the accumulated wisdom of the ages, she says in the first point. She has 6 points in the recapitulation. And it's just recapitulating what she has done up to that point, which is 272 in the current de Zurkov edition. Accumulated wisdom is the first point of the recapitulation. She mentions that it's all recorded on a few pages of geometrical signs and glyphs. Now, I've heard people sometimes say we can just take a symbol and meditate on it and get something. Well, I think there's occasionally some possibility of that. I don't deny it. But I remember that Lama Govinda was talking about a mantram and also these tankas, Tibetan tankas. If we looked at a Tibetan tanka and knew nothing about Buddhism, it would be an interesting picture to us. Or maybe one we didn't like very much. We would look at it like, a survey and art course. It wouldn't have any meaning, and I personally think we could stare at it from now till eternity and it wouldn't have any meaning either, because our mind isn't prepared to sort of understand. But with the background of that culture and the constant association of use of one symbol for certain ideas, you see, then the combination of those images in the tanka might trigger a gestalt in you, you see, where I got it finally, you see. These symbols and glyphs, you and I probably could look at and wouldn't mean very much. But an adept, you see, that's all they would need. That symbol is like a shorthand, and the sight of that symbol is enough to bring forward its full content, you see. Not that they necessarily, once they know it, would have to look at the symbol, but it was preserved in that way. And she starts the whole secret doctrine by, isn't it just it's a disc first, isn't it? I think there's a disc, and then there's a point, and then there's a line, and then there's another line, and that's the secret doctrine from the adept's point of view. But you see, it's like poetry also. From my point of view, the poem wouldn't mean much to us either if there wasn't something in us already that resonates with it. And that line in the poem brings that right forward and lifts us up, Okay. I've emphasized before what the adepts say, that here again, they spent their lives in learning, not teaching, for very, very long periods of time. And over the idea of, that's been saved through cataclysms and shifting continents. Don't you think that's interesting? She talked about shifting continents long before anybody thought that was true. And now it's quite accepted that the continents have shifted and will probably continue to do so. And then she says that nothing is accepted by an adept except, how did they do so? It is answered by checking, testing, and verifying in every department of nature the traditions of old, not just accepting the traditions of old. No vision of one adept was accepted till it was checked and confirmed by adepts and by centuries of experience. And we want to take every little intuition we get as final truth. I'm not saying don't listen to your intuitions. I think we should. But if we do not test them out, we're assuming we're committing the sin of hubris, because, that's when the mortal stepped on the rug reserved only for the god. The second point is the one divine substance principle, is what she says. That there's really, she calls it substance-principle, because it's not substance, it's not principle. There's only one reality, and in different stages, like the image again of the sea and the iceberg. The iceberg is a state and a stage within the one, and this whole indivisible reality goes through stages of change, you see, not the background real which never changes, but in its manifested state, it goes through these various stages. So she calls that the substance principle. And the third one is the universe is the periodical manifestation of this unknown absolute essence. So I suppose you can just say periodicity. This is a constant process, just as human beings are born and die, the universes do the same thing. They come into existence, they go out of existence. And the fourth point is the universe and everything in it is Maya. So the idea of Maya, M-A-Y-A, it's illusory or illusion, but we want to be careful with the word illusion because it sometimes suggests that it doesn't exist. The manifested world exists, but it's temporal. It's a process, and it continues to the point where it no longer exists, and therefore it's ephemeral. A rainbow. Isn't it beautiful? We saw lots and lots of them at Iguazu in Brazil. Absolutely 3 solid miles of Niagara Falls. Unbelievable, unbelievable. In any case, as we walked along, one beautiful, gorgeous rainbow. You go a little further, another gorgeous, beautiful rainbow. What is that rainbow? That rainbow doesn't have any independent existence, does it? We think we do, but do we really, see? And yet it's gorgeous. It's just reflections through the mist. And the mist is part of that river, you see. It's sprayed up from the river and it goes back to the river. And the interaction of the sun creates that gorgeous situation that we call rainbow. The 5th one, all is conscious. There's nothing that isn't alive, therefore nothing that isn't conscious. So even an atom is conscious, but we mustn't anthropomorphize it. It's bad enough we do that with our pets without doing it with atoms. But there's a kind of dim consciousness, a kind of awareness. I often think with the quark theory and everything, you know, where they don't know where an electron's going to jump. That's not quark theory, but they don't really know exactly what it's going to do. They can just predict in a general way. I often wonder if that isn't the kind of evidence of the dim kind of consciousness that the atom has. That's a pure guess, and it may be utterly, utterly mistaken. But I've often thought, I wonder if that doesn't give some little idea that the atom has a will of its own, in a sense, you know, to do what it wishes to do and won't be trapped into somebody's thought of how it's going to behave in a given situation. Anyway, everything is alive. And the 6th one is that everything is guided from within outward, that the evolutionary process does not work by accident, as was originally more or less thought by Darwin, that certain changes, adaptations were made, it worked, and therefore it continued, but that there was actually an inner purpose, an inner order. I prefer the word order to purpose, actually. An inner order gradually asserting itself on the substance. So similarly to the image I so often use of putting iron filings on a piece of paper, they line up with a magnetic field if you put the magnet under it, don't they? It's the inner order of the field that determines how that stuff will line up, you see? So that from a theosophical view, that's how evolution works, except it's a dynamic field, a moving field, a constantly changing field, and it organizes, it brings about the changes in nature from an inner level. And she posits the idea that this is accomplished via intelligences which are metaphorized as archangels, as devas, as dhyani chohans, and they are at the high levels devoid of personality. They are not persons. When we say in Theosophy there is no personal God, although every member has every right to believe in a personal God, though the doctrine states there is no personal God, it does not mean that the profoundest levels of spirit do not have effect on our person. They indeed do. And no one has ever denied that, as far as I know. But those profound levels of spiritual reality are not persons. They are not individual beings. They are the way things are, you see. And these intelligences are individualities in a sense, but not personalities with having the human situations of wrath and all that sort of stuff that we attribute to the Judeo-Christian God. But I just say before I forget that when you leave here and you go on, and if you're interested in looking further into the secret doctrine, if this course has in some way prompted your interest, and if it has done that, it served its purpose. Everything can be forgotten if it's done that, because you'll go on your own. Please remember a couple things. the topic approach is very useful, as I said. You'll find something that interests you. Maybe something will come up that you don't think about it in terms of the secret doctrine, some subject in theosophy, some problem of life even, whatever. And you just I wonder what HPB says about that in the secret doctrine, if it can throw any light on this. You'll go to the index. You may or may not find what you're looking for, but if you do, sometimes you'll find columns of entries, other times just a few. You'll start going to look it up. Sometimes you'll read the entire page and there'll be one tiny little reference and it doesn't mean a blasted thing to you. What I'm trying to say is you're going to get frustrated if you think you're going to find the answer every time or right away. Sometimes you have to go through so many references, and sometimes you read pages and you think, oh, is it really worth it, But the thing is, you'll find something that'll leap out at you and it'll make sense. And the more that happens, the more the other things fall into place, So if you just sort of bear that in mind in your own studies and don't get frustrated straight off, you'll find eventually it'll pay off. But it doesn't happen right away. Remember in the very beginning, she said, this kind of thinking cuts new paths in the brain. That's what she felt. We're so conditioned to thinking along certain lines. Getting back to poetry, you remember Thoreau, Walden Pond, and he pointed out that only after a few days where he was in an untrod place, walking down to the pond, New Englanders don't know the word lake. They call a lake a pond. It was a lake. And walking down to the pond, lake, he noticed he'd cut a path, and he likened it to our mind, you see, that we go along thinking along a certain route, and we just follow it naturally, the path of least resistance. We're suggesting by looking at the Theosophical philosophy, is suggesting by looking at this kind of material in the SD, you're actually forging new routes in your brain. You can't expect the first 10 minutes to solve the problems, but we live in an instant gratification society, and we give up a little too quickly. People say, oh, I can't meditate. Every time I make my mind quiet, it's just filled with all kinds of thoughts. Yes, that happens to everybody, because all those thoughts have been lying there in the background, and now we've created a vacuum and they jump in. But given time, we learn how to deal with them, and eventually we learn how to let them die, and progress is made. But if at the first sign of resistance we say, I can't do it, no use, right? I mean, you have to, everything that's worthwhile requires overcoming a little resistance, doesn't it, in life? Seems to me, anyway, it does. All right. 279 to 82, the proven facts. First one, the secret doctrine teaches no atheism. We were accused of that very often because we didn't suggest that the anthropomorphic Judeo-Christian God was in fact a living, real being who created everything. And she says, what we do, however, do is reject idols. And I want to say just a word about idols, because I really feel very often that the fundamentalists of any religion, including the Theosophical one, which isn't a religion, are idolaters. Because what are they doing? They have created in their own mind, out of their understanding of the texts, God. In other words, what I understand from the secret doctrine is the secret doctrine. Well, that's nonsense. Of course it isn't the secret doctrine. It's my understanding of the secret doctrine, isn't it? So that's the secret doctrine in many people's minds, and you better believe it, because it says so right here, and they can quote you chapter and verse. That seems to me idolatry. It is taking our ideas and making them the truth, you see? And to me, the bibliolaters, those who practically worship the Bible, if you ask them, do you worship the Bible, they'll say, no, I worship God. But it's always the thumping of the Bible, isn't it? And it's their interpretation of the Bible and their interpretation of God, and to me that is the greatest idolatry. It's not putting up a beautiful statue of Kuan Yin or a beautiful statue of the Blessed Virgin and saying that you're worshiping it. I mean, those are beautiful pieces of art sometimes. Sometimes they're not very beautiful pieces of art. But there are some gorgeous pieces of art that just can lift the soul, can it? And I don't think most people are worshiping this. I don't think anyone's really worshiping the statue, but that statue gives them an inspiration to make a leap, doesn't it, to something beyond the statue itself. They don't think the statue is the God. So idolatry, it seems to me, has, she emphasizes, of course, any anthropomorphic God, by which, of course, she means any, well, Voltaire put it best. He said, God created man in his own image, and man has been repaying the compliment ever since. We make God in our image, of course, yeah. So that was the first proven fact. The secret doctrine teaches no atheism except in this idea of rejection of idols. The second one is it admits a logos, or a collective creator of the universe, a demiurgos, in the sense implied when one speaks of an architect as the creator of an edifice, whereas that architect has never touched one stone of it. But while furnishing the plan, left all the manual labor to the masons. In our case, the plan was furnished by the ideation of the universe. And the way I understand that is the principles themselves, which somehow or other comes out of that beingness, you see, or an aspect of that, if you can say the beingness has any aspect. So it is the principles themselves which are the plan, or the order. I like the word order because as soon as you say plan, it's where's the planner? And there isn't any planner in the theosophical thought, you see. There's the order. It is. Nobody put it there. It's the way it is. Nobody created the order. It's there. In fact, even in the Christian system, the Son was begotten, not made, right? Not created. The order was not created. So the plan was furnished by the ideation of the universe, and the constructive labor was left to the hosts of intelligent powers and forces. But it's not a personal deity. So there's the second point. The third, they are dual in character, being composed of the irrational, brute energy inherent in matter and the intelligent soul or cosmic consciousness which directs and guides that energy. This results in a perpetual series of physical manifestations and moral effects on earth during manvantaric periods, the whole being subservient to karma. And I want to stop there and ask for a discussion on why do you think it results in moral effects? And I'm not going to give you an answer. I just think that's something that really is almost jolting when you read it. You know, the creation of the universe results in moral effects, and she's put it in italics, so she's saying, look at it. And I think I'd like to have us just look at it for a minute. What do you think, why would she have said that? I'm not giving any answer. I thought we might think about that. All right, there's another intriguing thing in this third point, and that is, she says, speaking of these higher powers, all are entitled to the grateful reverence of humanity. However, man ought to be ever striving to help the divine evolution of ideas, and she's italicized that again, by becoming to the best of his ability, and another italics, a co-worker with nature in the cyclic tasks. So we have that idea of the collective Dhyani Chohan being the creative powers and the brute energies being directed in a sense and by them. Then matter is eternal. That's the fourth point, and it's eternal only in that sense of it isn't eternal in a particular state. You see, it's eternal only in its final essence. So there's no inorganic or dead matter. That was mentioned before. And this is very interesting from Hermes the thrice great, or Trismegistus. O my son, matter becomes. Formerly it was, for matter is the vehicle of becoming. And in the state of before it becomes, it's called mula prakriti, in the abstract state, you see. And when it is matter, existent, then we call it matter. Same thing, different state, totally. Fifth one, the universe was evolved out of its ideal plan, upheld through eternity in the unconsciousness of that which the Vedantins call Parabrahm. That's the first fundamental proposition of the secret doctrine. And then she talks about Pralaya Manvantra, of course, activity or existence, God evolved, Deus explicitus, that is revealed, and the other side, Pralaya, passivity of being, God involved, Deus implicitus.
The following program was produced by the Theosophical Society in America.
She says she's introducing 3 new propositions in the second volume, you see. She calls these propositions. But still, the first 3 in the Secret Doctrine in the first volume are the basis of the entire thing. But now she's introducing 3 principles, new ones from in the second volume. 1, the simultaneous evolution of 7 human groups on 7 different portions of our globe. So she says there's 7 groups of human beings. She just said we're all one. And she never wants you to forget that there's an ultimate, indivisible unity, inescapable unity. At the same time, she says there's 7 groups, or what we might say types even, of human beings. You know, the idea of the 7 root races are rather large, long stages of human development, according to the Secret Doctrine idea. So we mustn't think of it in terms of ethnicity or anything like that. But she does say that each root race, meaning each major stage of human growth over many thousands of years, each of these stages, does have actually some physical characteristics. And you must understand that in these stages, they overlap enormously. She's talking about incredibly huge cycles in the second fundamental proposition, and she's trying to say, especially in the second volume, how those cycles and other things relate to the human race as part of the greater whole. And so these stages overlap enormously. It's not as though at a certain date the new race is incarnate and everyone being born is part of that new race. That would be rather quick. Within a few years you'd have one race gone and the new race around, wouldn't you? So it doesn't work like that at all. But what happens, she suggests, is that bit by bit individuals are born who are somehow qualitatively different from the previous group of people. Something is different about them. They have some kind of characteristics, inwardly and outwardly maybe, not so much outwardly maybe, but inwardly more, that are somehow different, a little different than the majority of human beings. And in the beginning, these people are the strange ones. Mind you, that doesn't mean we don't have real strange ones all the time. We always have real strange ones. But she's not meaning someone who has mental difficulties or anything like that. She means that they operate differently, I think myself, that they perceive the world somewhat differently, they function somewhat differently, they have a sort of different way of dealing with life than the previous ones, and they have a new ability that the previous ones don't seem to have so much. That's sort of a broad statement of, I think, the way she sees it. And in the beginning of this process, over many, many hundreds of years, the new race or sub-race, because we're now supposedly in the 5th root race, 5th sub-race of the 5th root race, and she says in several hundred years there will be a clear beginning of the 6th sub-race of the 5th root race. Only the sub-race, then the 7th sub-race, and then finally the beginnings of the real 6th root race. So these are enormous cycles. And as I said, in the beginning, the new ones seem somewhat odd. They gradually become a majority, you see. Bit by bit, more and more people fall into that category. And then the ones who belong to the former way of being or acting or thinking or dealing with life, if you want to put it that way, they're the odd ones, you see. They become the odd ones. So this overlap is just tremendous. In other words, it's not very perceivable at first. It's just, you can't just say, oh, now here's the beginning of the sixth root race, you see, or whatever. It's just enormous, enormous overlap. So I think that's an important thing to bear in mind, that it has this enormous overlap and wouldn't be very perceptible to most people for quite a long time. Now she says, in addition to this, and then she also says that these root races, while they happen chronologically in one sense, in another sense are always with us. And we talked about that during the week. And various suggestions was made as to what that might mean. It's always there in potential, so therefore it's always with us. And also some human individuals are able to take charge of themselves, and, well, we all are capable of doing it. Whether we do it is the question. But some people do take charge of themselves and really push forward in their own evolutionary development, because once human, she says, evolution proceeds further only by conscious effort. So if we don't do anything, there's a tendency to just go around the same track until we try inside ourselves to say, hey, I'm going to make some changes here. I'm going to do something about what's going on inside of me and expand. And then she says some individuals do that so exceedingly well that they go through all these root races while we're still dilly-dallying in the fifth sub-race of the fifth root race, you see. And they're way, way beyond us in terms of development. If you think of the root races as stages of development, you get rid of this historicity thing, you know, it all happens to happen chronologically, you see, and so forth and so on. Although I think still the stages occur in an orderly fashion. I still personally feel you wouldn't be able to develop the sixth race abilities without having developed the fifth race abilities first, you see, because we live in an orderly universe, don't we? As I said before, you know, that to say contrary is tantamount to saying that the unabridged dictionary is the result of an explosion in the printing factory. So she talks about land masses, and when she says continent, it's important to remember it isn't, first of all, she was one of the first to come up with continental drift idea. Long before it was acceptable, she said the continents didn't look in the past like they look now. There was all sorts of changes in the continents. Well, it sounded probably quite silly when she said it, not meaning blessed. Yet today, that's an acceptable theory, you see. And she claims it'll change again. So it was land masses and a continent in one sense of maybe an aggregate, but not to get too literal about the word continent. So that's one of her first points in the second volume. Second one is that the linga sharira, what she calls, and here I think the later literature had a better term, the etheric double. And she insists upon that coming into existence before the physical. So this, in a way, is evidence in the human kingdom of this idea of evolution coming from within without. That first things happen at the most ethereal, subjective levels, the most homogeneous levels, and then gradually you might say it condenses until it finally becomes the physical level. Something like that as a metaphor. And there's a very interesting example of how this etheric may come into existence before the physical. I don't think I mentioned it this week, but I'm sure I mentioned it in the course last year. And that is that if you take a chick's egg, you will discover that we think of the heart as a pump. I think most of us do, non-medical people. We think of it as pumping the blood through the system. Well, indeed, it seems to do that. But curiously, in the chicken's egg, a pulse occurs in the egg at the place where the heart will be. There's no heart. Doesn't that suggest the etheric double? That the inner is pulsing and creating that pulsing phenomenon in the protoplasm, in the substance of the egg, before there's a heart. So the pulse begins where the heart is going to form. And then the heart forms. And that's precisely what she says about how you and I come into existence. First, the etheric double, or the force field, dynamic force field. Like, if you can imagine that as like a magnetic field except a pulsing field, you see. then you can see how it affects the stuff in the same way that the magnetic field affects the iron filings. So it creates the pulse first, and then by its very nature, the atoms, the molecules, the cells form and aggregate around its nature, you see. And she insists upon that, so that the idea that this inner is formed before the outer. And she singles out the etheric double, or what she calls linga sharira, for that. Now she says that humanity preceded every mammalian form, including the anthropoids. The human being, primarily from the theosophical point of view, is manas, mind. That's what the human being is. Self-conscious awareness and intelligence. That's the human being. And that, she says, preceded the human state as mind, preceded the human state incarnate in physical vehicles. So the first two root races, or major stages of development, according to her, of the history of this humanity, were not physical. There were no physical human beings in the early development of the human race, according to her. There were, oh, she has some strange things. You want to read some science fiction, read about some of the early root races. I mean, there were pudding bag humans, you see, that used to sort of just split apart from one another they were androgyne. Both sexes in one, right? And she said, you know, it's very interesting. I had a course at New York University with a rabbi, a very erudite rabbi, who I twisted his arm and had him come talk at the TS on the Kabbalah, though he didn't believe a word of Kabbalah. But he had marvelous understanding of their points, you see. And he was very kind and said he would come, even though we couldn't offer him anything more than half the take of the lecture. He said, oh, I'll do it for a student. So he came. I'm sure our theosophical audience thought he was a Kabbalist because he knew so much, but he didn't believe it. But he said a very curious thing, very theosophical, actually. He said that the first creature was an androgyne, because what happened in the second creation myth, mind you, there's two in the Bible. I let the fundamentalists fight out which one is the true one. But the second creation myth in Genesis is the one where God takes the rib out, you see. And as Adam said afterward, God, I got more ribs. You got more women? So obviously that was both sexes were in one, wasn't it? And that's how this erudite rabbi regarded this story. That was his view. And I thought, wow. And so there's a possible leftover of the wisdom religion idea, you see, that the original human beings were non-sexist. We're trying to get back to that, at least psychologically now, aren't we, in terms of prejudice, not in terms of differences, because I'll maintain to my dying breath there are differences and they're not just physical. But what are they? There's too much social and cultural conditioning to really ferret it all out, don't you think now? And even in the Secret Doctrine, the idea is that at the deepest levels, it's androgyne still. And from my personal point of view, that's where the adept resides. It's either neither. That's the adept at that level. And the adept has quite the ability to incarnate either as a male or a female. But the real adept is at that level, whereas St. Paul says there is neither Jew nor Greek, bond nor free, male nor female, for we are all one. And he uses the Christian term for that, in Christ. But that, of course, is a term used in that culture for the very same thing we're talking about by buddhi and that kind of thing. There is a very definite possibility that this idea of the presence of humanity, of manas, like the etheric double created the pulsing and eventually brought the heart into existence, consider that possibility, that the presence of manas influenced the development of the mammalian forms. You see? That's a real possibility from my point of view. If you think of it as a force field, if you think of mind as a force field, then the very presence of it might, to a certain extent, begin to organize what becomes a human brain. Don't take it too seriously, but that's an interesting way of looking at it, isn't it? That's one possibility of how you can see that maybe it's true, even from the lesser mammalian forms, that the presence of manas drew them forth, as the presence of the etheric double drew forth the heart. You see what I mean? It could be that way. Now, she says, humanity came into being imperfect. Oh, well, isn't that news? I mean, you know, who's perfect, right? But humanity came into being imperfect. There's a very interesting story, I believe it's in Kabbalah. Isaac asks God, why, when he created humanity, did he not say it was good, as he did of all the other creations? Remember, he says, created whatever it was, and it was good. He created human beings. He didn't say it was good. Why didn't he say? Isaac says, typical Jewish, you know, so why didn't you say that? I mean, I want an answer, you know. It's a question. Why didn't you do that? God said, in answer, he said, because humanity was created incomplete. However, God said, he gave us his laws by which we could complete ourselves. Isn't that a wonderful theosophical idea found in the mystical writings of the Jews? Fascinating theosophical idea. It's a poetic treatment of the secret doctrine idea that humans must take their own evolution in hand and change themselves, that we're not complete. I frequently have said what I'm quoting from someone else. I don't know who first came up with it, someone in New York, either Emily Sellen or Fritz Kuntz. We're not really finished human beings. We're human beings in the making. We're evolving toward the full human potential. It's the adepts who have realized the human potential, and they insist, of course, over and over again, they are human. They're not gods. They don't want to be worshipped. They simply have developed to the full the human possibilities. And we have developed partially the human possibilities, but reside mostly in the lesser developed nature, the animal nature. We're more reactive, aren't we? Sort of blown by whatever hits us, responding to whatever hits us, like the animal does. Isn't that what the animal does? It responds to what's in front of it all the time. It isn't, as far as we can tell, reflective. It doesn't consider. Fritz Kuntz used to say that a cat doesn't lie down and consider, look at its tail and consider that's the end of me. You see, we are reflective. It appears that animals aren't. We can consider our past. We can think about what we've learned and what might occur in the future if we act in certain ways. It would appear that essentially animals don't do that. Remember, it's a continuum, and you will find shreds of it and examples of it in a very, light way. In fact, HPB says, I believe, I can be corrected if I'm wrong on this, but I understand she said at one point that the apes are human. I think she actually said that at one point. You can check it out and see if I'm right or wrong on the reference. And that, in a way, sort of explains it a little bit. I think she talked about the sin of the mindless. Wasn't that what she said? That the humans mated with animal forms and something like that and produced the higher apes at some point. And who knows? I mean, that's her explanation. Whether it's right or not, I couldn't tell you. But there was a very interesting experiment. For quite a while, a lot of people felt that apes didn't have self-consciousness, that only human beings had that. And there was one interesting experiment. They took a gorilla, I believe it was, and they anesthetized her, and then they put some vegetable dye on the back of her head, something that would be quite harmless to her, and she would have no knowledge it was there, just like a hair dye, And then they put a mirror in the cage, and there was a hand mirror. So the possibility was that at one point, playing with the mirror, she might see the back of her head reflected in the other mirror. Well, of course, that eventually did occur. And when she saw it, and the mirror was back there, when she saw that, she paused for a minute and then went like that. She knew it was the back of her own head, you see. And also they've taught, there's argument as to whether it's language, but they've taught quite a large number of signs to some apes that can communicate. And at times they seem to put these together in ways that indicates that to a certain limited extent they do have conceptual mind, and they can, but the range of the vocabulary is what, at the range of a 2 or 3 year old or something, John? It never gets beyond a certain 300 different words, and that's about it. And a young child has lots more than 300 words. So it seems to be a very limited ability, but there's a continuum, you see. There is intelligence. There's a difference between language and conceptual ability and communication. There's no question whatsoever that animals, even insects, communicate with one another. Look at the ants. They tell, it isn't really words, they communicate where food is, don't they? And what do? And the bees, they do those dances to tell where the nectar is. So they're communicating, but it's not language, it's different. And with the ant, they'll follow back right over the path the other ant went. And was it Benchley or Mark Twain or one of those characters? He said, have you ever watched an ant? It'll come to a blade of grass, and instead of going around the blade of grass, will climb up one side, down the other side. He said, this is tantamount to trying to go from London to Paris via the Strasbourg steeple. So he was suggesting they were sort of dumb. You say, why not take the short route? Oh, definitely there's communication. Definitely there's intelligence. Manas is everywhere, in the atoms as well. But self-conscious, directed, it's different in the human.